Hello, I'm Lorraine Hawkins. I'm the River Director for the Dee District Salmon Fishery Board and the River Dee Trust. This series of presentations is to explain Save the Spring, a programme of work to restore and future-proof the River Dee catchment. We've just held a series of 3 events to explain the programme. 2 were in person in Bankery and 1 was online. We're now just creating this as an online resource so people can refer to it and find out more about the programme. Save the Spring is a partnership programme between the River Dee Trust, the Dee District Salmon Fishery Board and the Atlantic Salmon Trust. So in this video you'll hear presentations from myself, Jonathon Muir, who is Head of Communications at the Atlantic Salmon Trust, Edwin, who's River Operations Manager for the Dee Fishery Board, Professor Melanie Smith, who's the Research Director at the Atlantic Salmon Trust, and also Dr. Victoria Pritchard, who is geneticist and a senior researcher at the University of Highlands and Islands. So the Save the Spring programme was launched just last October, so it is early on and we still have much of the detail to be developed. But we wanted to engage everyone early on in that process and hear and incorporate their thoughts and ideas. So for a lot of people who may be interested in the programme, a key interest is around salmon, but there's also a wider group of stakeholders that are interested in this work, and that is everybody who lives within the Dee catchment, as ultimately the issues that we are tackling through this programme affect our environment and our life. All of us on Deeside has suffered from the severe floods in recent years, feeling that our summers are becoming hotter and drier, getting concerned, or should be getting concerned, about the increasing frequency of droughts. Droughts are now predicted to occur in every 1 of 2 years. And also, maybe not top of people's concern, but it is a concern to us, the loss of the Cairngorm snowpack, which traditionally fed the river during the spring and early summer and is a supply for our drinking water. And all these climate-linked changes are also leading to major pressures in our iconic Atlantic salmon populations. So, for example, 60% of our monitoring sites in the Upper Dee last year had excessive temperatures that would cause stress to salmon. As another example, we carried out a fish rescue on the River Cluny last year. This is the river that goes into the Dee at Braemar. The fish rescue was needed because fish had become stranded in the main channel as the water levels had dropped. However, that was back in May, so it really goes to show the changes that we're already experiencing with the climate. So it perhaps wasn't to be a surprise that just last month in December, salmon in Great Britain were reclassified to endangered status by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. But it's not happening in isolation. Atlantic salmon are just part of the habitat and the crisis facing our ecosystem and the wider biodiversity. We truly are in a nature and climate emergency. We have optimism through this programme that we still have an opportunity to change this pathway, but as long as we act now, and this is what Save the Spring aims to achieve. So Save the Spring is an ambitious programme. It has the aims of restoring a thriving population of salmon to the Dee, supporting an abundancy and diversity of wildlife, and creating a healthy environment for people. The programme addresses the big causes of the salmon decline and the general nature decline, and this is not a quick fix, hence we're setting out a 20-year programme of work. Now, for those with wider interests, you may be wondering why such a focus on one species. Well, the Atlantic salmon is a keystone species, meaning it has a significant impact on its own ecosystem. It's also an indicator of the health of our rivers and oceans, as well as being a connector in terms of nutrients and energy between our freshwater and marine environment. So as a species, it's really important. We also have a unique salmon population here. It has its own unique lineage, and that's due to the species' unique homing ability to return to their place of birth. So this has created genetically distinct subpopulations that are not only adapted to the river system they're from, but also the subcatchments within the river system. We also on the Dee have spring salmon, which is a genetically distinct component of the species Atlantic salmon. So really, just to underline here, what we have is really special. So the situation on the Dee now is that some of those unique subpopulations are at risk of extinction. For example, on the Gurnock Burn, which is a tributary that goes into the Dee just above Ballater, that has seen the number of female salmon returning from the sea to spawn each year suffer a major decline. Back in the 1960s, around 150 female salmon would return each year to spawn. Last autumn, only 2 females returned. So it's this potential for an incremental loss of these subpopulations, such as the one that occurs in the Gurnock Burn, that is likely to cause a loss of genetic diversity in our whole salmon population, meaning that our Dee salmon population will have less ability and less resilience to face future changes and impacts such as climate change. So the greatest decline has so far occurred in our spring salmon on the Dee, and the rod catches for spring salmon clearly show that. The decadal catches have declined by 80% since the 1970s, and even more rapidly in the last 10 years. Therefore, the focus of Save the Spring is the upper catchment, because that's the heartland of our spring salmon stock. We think of the upper catchment as generally the area west of Aboyne, which is about 50% or half of the catchment. But of course the upper catchment affects the lower catchment, so we can't view them as independent. Now, in terms of how we're going to address these problems, well, I'm going to be light on the detail because the following presentations explain this in greater depth. But the key for us is that we're taking a linked approach. So at the heart of this is a focus on landscape scale habitat restoration, but that's being done in combination with closely monitored fishery population at a local scale to address those subpopulations at greatest risk of extinction. Additionally, there is work in the marine transition zone to look at survival and try and improve success of fish moving through that area. And as well as that, there's huge stakeholder engagement so that we can ensure a lasting legacy for this programme. So where will this take us in 20 years' time? Well, we're aiming for riverbank trees to keep our rivers cool, functioning floodplains, new wetland and wet woodland habitats, biodiverse freshwater habitats, and stable riverbeds supporting diverse and increasing salmon populations which have resilience for the future.
Hi, my name is Jonathon Muir. I am Head of Communications at the Atlantic Salmon Trust, and I'm going to build on what Lorraine has set up there in her introduction and explain this strategic approach that this partnership is proposing to take with the Save the Spring programme. So also to reiterate, we are in the very early stages of developing this project. We're currently recruiting, we're looking for a project lead who can help us take this work forward and accelerate it. So a lot of the detail is yet to be determined, but this partnership all agreed that it was really important to communicate the plans and the path of thinking from the very beginning, so everyone is on board, and also to have your voices heard, and that's been really important throughout our stakeholder engagement sessions. So why a strategic landscape scale approach? That's what we're talking about. As Lorraine rightly outlined, wild salmon are facing a new set of challenges compared to a few decades ago. We're in a very different world compared to then. We all see the increasing effects of a changing climate on our rivers. Less snow on the hills, less snowmelt in the spring, wetter winters with frequent severe flooding events, and now very often low warm water conditions in the spring and summer too. And those factors in the winter are contributing to the washing out of eggs from redds and the destabilisation of spawning substrates. And in the spring and summer where we now have that low warm water very often, it's meaning those smolts, those juvenile salmon on their way out to sea, often lacking sufficient flows to get them out safely or quickly enough, helping them evade predators, but also contributing to poorer nutrition in the rivers, poorer growing conditions. In tandem with those issues in our freshwater catchments, We also know that the marine environment has changed as well, and the reduction in marine survival is one of the major factors that has influenced salmon decline. So if you go back to the 1980s, perhaps 20% of outgoing smolts might have returned as adults in a year with favourable conditions, and now that's probably somewhere between 2 and 5%. But importantly, the science has told us that bigger, healthier wild smolts survive better at sea. And the evidence shows that larger smolts, those fitter smolts, may have 2 to 3 times the survival success during their marine migration when compared to smaller, less fit fish. So sending healthy wild smolts out to sea is absolutely vital, and temperature and feeding in the freshwater environment is really critical to that. So the message here is what we do in the freshwater environment is intrinsically linked with marine survival. So we have to work on our freshwater catchment and the surrounding landscape to give those young fish the best possible start in life, so they have the best chance of overcoming the challenges that we know are in the marine zone. So back to the strategic approach. The first part of this two-pronged strategy is therefore to restore natural processes in the landscape, to give the young fish what they need to go to sea in the best condition possible. And put very simply, that is cold, clean water with sufficient flow and access. And that means working to reduce the temperatures, controlling the flow of water off the land and into the river, reducing the impact of those flooding events, and also maintaining better flow conditions throughout the spring and summer. But it also means giving the fish shelter, protection from predation, a diverse river channel, and plenty of invertebrate life for food. Now, Edwin is going to talk in a lot more detail about that first part of the strategic approach, that's what we do to the river and what we do to the surrounding landscape. But while that habitat work to the landscape takes place, nature also needs a helping hand, and this partnership absolutely recognises that the habitat restoration, while an essential part of the equation, will not solve the present crisis on its own. We have to intervene. Now, interventions are not new, but an increasing body of evidence is supporting the need to really preserve carefully the genetic diversity that you have within your wild salmon population. And the approach that this partnership is proposing to take has that very much in mind. So the second part of this two-pronged strategic approach, therefore, is wild fish repopulation. And that's the helping hand, that is the intervention that I spoke about. Just as there's no point putting fish in the river if they don't have good habitat to live in, there's no point restoring habitat if there's no fish there to use it. So we need to give them a boost, and that is what this second part of the strategy is about. Now, the wild fish repopulation element of the programme is quite innovative, it's quite novel in some cases, and as Professor Melanie Smith will explain a little bit later in this series of videos, the focus is very much on giving the salmon in the catchment as immediate a boost as possible while maintaining the genetic integrity of the population, and that's what's going to enable the Dee salmon to adapt and hopefully overcome the challenges they face in a very quickly changing world. So that's the second part of the strategy, and it's intended to operate absolutely in tandem with the habitat work. It's a joined up strategic programme. And the focus on it is really to provide an immediate boost to the number of spawning wild adult salmon in the river. And ultimately that's what we all want in this partnership and in the programme. Wild adult Dee salmon spawning in the river naturally and creating more wild Dee salmon. That is the goal of this programme. So that's an overview of the strategic approach that this partnership is proposing to take with Save the Spring, with joined up thinking between all that habitat and landscape scale restoration and the wild fish repopulation working hand in hand. Next in this video, other individuals involved in the programme are going to take you through those two elements of the strategy in a lot more detail.
So my name is Edwin. I'm the River Operations Manager for the Dee District Salmon Fishery Board. I'm going to talk to you about the restoring natural processes, that first half, that key part of the Saving the Spring strategy. As part of my talk, I'm going to look at some of the issues that we're facing in our upland rivers where our spring fish come from, and I'm going to look at some of the solutions that we've been using in the last few years and what we need to do in the future. So we all know that one of the big things that are affecting our Atlantic salmon is marine survival. Marine survival is so low now and has been for the last few decades. But there's also big problems in the freshwater environment, and I'm going to look at that in a wider context. So we've got something like an 83% decline across the board in our freshwater species. We've had an 85% decline in our wetland species, and we've lost so much of our wetlands. We're seeing a 90% decline in European eels since the 1980s and 1990s, and on the Dee in the last 20 years we've had an 89% decline in freshwater pearl mussels. So what's some of the reasons that might be causing the issues in our freshwater environments? There's many reasons, and I'm not going to mention them all here, but deforestation is one of the things. When we cut down all the woodlands in Scotland, it profoundly changed our rivers, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But also, the river is not just the wet bit in the middle of this slide. It's also the riparian zone. It's the adjacent land use. Anything that happens there has an impact on the river. So if we've got damaging land use practices, that can feed into the river. If we have positive land use practices with good diversity and biodiversity, that can feed into the river. So the adjacent land use is very important to the health of our river. Drainage and channel modifications have been huge over decades or hundreds of years, and that really impacts the health of our rivers. Blocking up side channels, draining the land, that all impacts on our rivers. And even in the uplands, we've manipulated and simplified our rivers to the detriment of a lot of our freshwater biodiversity. Pollution, again, is always a big thing in freshwater systems, and on top of all these many impacts, we've got climate change really weighing down in some of these freshwater species now, and that's something that you'll hear through many of the talks today. So Scotland's deforestation, about 5,000 years ago, Scotland was at peak woodland cover, and most of Scotland was covered in forest. Up 2,000 years ago, when the Romans had arrived, we'd already got rid of about 50% of our forests in Scotland, and by 1900 we were down to just 5% forest cover. So we have deforested Scotland over a long period, but we've deforested Scotland. Things have went up a bit since 1900, and we're now at 13% woodland cover in the Upper Dee catchment. The Scottish average is 19% and the European average is 37%. So the Upper Dee is very much below the average in terms of woodland cover, and much of that 13% of woodland cover is conifer plantations grown for timber. They're not exactly the best thing for biodiversity on the riverbank. So it tells me that there's a lot of room to get some woodland into these upland catchments. It doesn't mean blanket forestry, it means the right trees in the right place on the riverbank, and that could have huge benefits. And one of the reasons that I'm really keen on having trees in our uplands is the temperature thing. In 2018, over 70% of Scotland's rivers were reaching temperatures that were causing thermal stress to our juvenile salmon. And we've had temperatures in the Upper Dee on the River Gairn, which is only 2% woodland cover. We've had temperatures of over 27 degrees. Now this is something that we're just going to get more frequently, and we're going to get temperatures potentially in excess of that. At 27.5 degrees, we're getting very close to the fatal limit for young salmon in these upland streams. There's been identified over 300 kilometres of river in the Upper Dee that are vulnerable to these high peak summer temperatures. They've all been mapped by Marine Scotland Science. So there's a real problem on the Dee with high temperatures, and this is something that we've really got to work on fast before they become absolutely lethal to salmon. So one of the ways that we can combat this is bankside trees. They can mitigate that high peak temperatures. They can take the high temperatures down a couple of degrees, and that might not be perfect, but it can buy the salmon a little bit of a time to adapt to these increasing summer temperatures. So getting some dappled shade on the riverbank, not wall-to-wall trees, but getting sufficient shade on the riverbank can really help mitigate those peak temperatures. But trees are not just great for buffer and high temperatures, they also provide lots of food in the uplands. Something like 50% of the energy into the stream can come from riparian vegetation such as trees, shrubs, tall herbs, grasses. So having that diverse riparian zone can really feed into the nutrient in these upland streams. And these upland streams are often lacking in nutrient, and that extra food means extra food for fish, extra fitness for fish. Not only do that, with these times of increasing floods and instability in the riverbank trees and good vegetation can hold the banks together, making the rivers more stable, and that's got to be a good thing. The other thing is the trees create fantastic habitat. The roots trail into the river, creating cover and refuge for fish. And when the trees eventually do topple over and fall in a flood or in a storm, they can really create good sheltered areas and habitat for fish and lots of other wildlife. So trees have many benefits, and a good riparian buffer going up through the hills with lots of good varied vegetation is fantastic for biodiversity. That interface between our rivers and our land should be really rich in a biodiverse way, and so having a good vegetation buffer could really increase the biodiversity. And it could also link catchments. Rivers like the Gairn could link over to the Anne, and you could have a wildlife corridor. Rivers like the Geldie could link over to the Feshy, and you could have that continuous cover that would link catchments and make populations that are vulnerable able to move around and move around the catchment. So these things are really important, not just for the temperature, but the whole general health of the uplands. Not just the temperatures, but we're also, everybody knows we suffer really badly in the last decades from floods and droughts, and those have been really devastating. And the likelihood is that this isn't just a blip, this is something that we're going to get in the future regularly and potentially more extreme. So that's something that is, we've really got to factor in as we manage these river catchments in the future. This instability threatens vulnerable species and us and our communities, so that it is something that we really need to be aware of and be able to manage in the future. I'll take the instability for example. In 2002 a survey was done of the riverbed of the Dee from Braemar to Aberdeen. 50% of the riverbed was found to be stable. When that survey was repeated by the same people in the same methodology in 2022, 20 years later, only 10% of the riverbed was stable, and that has got to be a result from these big floods that we've been having on the Dee and elsewhere across Scotland. And that's one of the key reasons that things like freshwater pearl mussels are really suffering and threatened with extinction. So that instability in the river is something that we really need to be aware of in the future, and it impacts on things like egg survival for our salmon, migration timing for the fish going to sea, and also juvenile densities. So that instability of the river is something that we need to tackle in the future. So we need to plan that resilience and build it into how we manage the catchment in the future, because there's more of this coming down the line. So what have we been doing about it? Well, we've been trying to take a strategic approach at a catchment scale over the last 8 or 9 years. We've planted over 460,000 native trees on the banks of the Dee and its tributaries above Ballater. We've also put in conjunction with the trees, 260 of these large wood structures to create these really good in-stream habitat that gives shelter to fish in periods of drought and flood and from predators. We've done 200 kilometres of buffer strips, and I can't overestimate how important buffer strips are. Really important in the future to allow rivers' natural processes, give them a bit of room where you can to meander and change. Rivers are dynamic systems, so giving them room is a really good way of sort of making them resilient in the future. We've also connected up old channels and we've restored floodplains, but we've just basically started that work. There needs to be a lot more. We've reinstalled wetlands, we've done debris dams and leaky dams to try and hold back the flow in these high likelihood flood events. So we've made a good start, and you can see we know the techniques that can work to assist the natural recovery of these upland rivers. Things like good riparian zones, tree planting, large wood structure for complex habitat, remove bank works that are not needed anymore, inappropriate, remove barriers, set back flood embankments to give the river room. All of these things help assist the river in its natural processes. So we know what to do. Saving the Spring is all about amping up what we've done already and doing it at a bigger scale and more urgency. And really, to stand a chance, we need to get this done really, really urgently and at scale. So that's really what Save the Spring is all about in terms of the restoration. So we've got a lot to do, and we want to return those natural processes where it's appropriate to do so and where we can. We've got a lot of techniques out there that can help us focus and prioritise our work. There's maps like we showed the Marine Scotland Science maps about the temperatures and the vulnerable areas that we can target. Also, SEPA's got a lot of data on there about where assisted natural recovery would work in the upland rivers. And bringing all this together would really give us a chance to prioritise our targets and to move forward in the best and most strategic way. But we're really working hard to restore this habitat, and the one worry is that the fish numbers are ever declining, and if they decline much more, we won't have enough fish in these upland tributaries to take advantage of all the habitat. And this is where the wild fishery population really ties in with the restoration. There's no point doing restoration if there's no fish there to help, and there's no point putting in fish if there's not the habitat to help. So both of these things together, I think, are the key for holding on to our salmon. So Atlantic salmon are threatened with extinction. We've heard that from Sir David Attenborough, and nobody's going to argue with that, and that's a really frightening thought. I think from what I've said today, the marine and the freshwater environments are really interlinked. We can affect the marine survival if we put out really good quality, fit, healthy smolts to sea. They've got a better chance of coming back to us. We urgently need to create resilience in our river to these climate changes, to give the salmon time to adapt, but also to give us in these catchments, communities, time to adapt. And I think native woodland planting in these upland areas is a real priority, and it's something we can do that would have multiple benefits. We can turn this around if we really act urgently. There's always significant challenges with these. I've been doing this a long time. I'm not naive. It's not always going to be a playing field, but we've really got to push at this and do it urgently. The last thing to say, I think Lorraine will tell us what we can do to help, but I think we all really need to pull together to help our Atlantic salmon and our river. They've supported us for thousands of years, Atlantic salmon, and it's now our chance to help them. And from the work that I've done, I can see we can make a difference. If we just give nature a helping hand, you can see the difference that can make, and I think that's the best thing going forward in the future that we can do to help our salmon and help restore our river.
Hi, my name is Victoria Pritchard. I work at the UHI Institute for Biodiversity and Freshwater Conservation up in Inverness. And Atlantic Salmon Trust and the Dee have asked me here today to give you a little overview about why genetics is important when you're considering Atlantic salmon conservation, and really to explain some of the background why the Dee and the Atlantic Salmon Trust have chosen the salmon repopulation strategy that they have. So all of us here know that Atlantic salmon are born in fresh water. When they're juveniles, they imprint on their freshwater location, and then after they've migrated to sea and come back to freshwater to spawn, they navigate back right to the place where they were spawned to produce the next generation. Now I want you to imagine a scenario where two salmon populations, let's call it the brown population and the blue population, they spawn in different locations in the river. So the brown population spawns above this waterfall that's quite hard to navigate, and the blue population spawns in this nice shallow river. So you can imagine for a salmon to be able to get over this waterfall, it has to have certain physical characteristics. It might need a bigger heart, or bigger fins, or might have to metabolize its energy in a certain way. And you could also imagine that those physical characteristics that make it good at navigating the waterfall actually make it vulnerable to heat stress that it might encounter in a wide and shallow stream such as the blue salmon spawn in. What happens when the salmon are coming back is that salmon that don't have the characteristics to navigate the waterfall will not make it up there and will not reproduce. At the same time, salmon that don't have the characteristics to survive in the wide shallow stream, for example, because they're more susceptible to heat stress, won't reproduce in that stream. This is an example of natural selection. And this phenomenon is happening between and across rivers, all rivers where salmon will spawn. So what you end up with is a large river network, such as the Dee, will classically have different salmon populations spawning in different tributaries, each of which are genetically adapted to the local conditions. All these little genetically different populations constitute a genetic portfolio which together represents the entire genetic diversity of the drainage. So as well as genetic variation between all the different populations breeding in different parts of the river, there's also important genetic variation within these different salmon populations. For example, every fisherman knows that Atlantic salmon spend different periods of time at sea and they come back at different ages and different sizes. So for example, when a salmon goes to sea, it may spend only 1 year out there and come back as a grilse, or it may spend several years and come back as a large multi-sea winter fish. And we know now that whether a fish comes back as a multi-sea winter salmon or a grilse is very strongly determined by one gene with two different variants. One variant which means the salmon comes back early, and the other which means the salmon comes back after several years. Similarly, in Scotland, another gene has a very large effect on whether a salmon comes back early in the year as a spring salmon, or whether it comes back later in the year as an autumn or winter salmon. And such genetic variation within a population is another part of the salmon's genetic portfolio. So for example, some years it may be good to be a multi-sea winter salmon. Some years it may be better in the environmental conditions to come back in the spring. So this genetic variation within a salmon population acts as a sort of insurance which allows the population to persist over environmental conditions that change from year to year. And collectively, all this genetic diversity among populations and within populations is the raw material that salmon can use to evolve and adapt to changing conditions in the future. So this is why maintaining genetic diversity is so important to increase the security of our Atlantic salmon. So let's imagine a scenario where you're starting to see low numbers of breeding adults returning above the waterfall. And you would like to do an intervention to try and maintain or increase the population numbers. One option you might consider is taking salmon from the blue population and then adding them to the brown population, either as juveniles or as adult fish. So in this scenario, the juveniles might survive very well. They might go to sea with the brown salmon. The adults might reproduce with the brown salmon and produce hybrids. So everything might be seen to be going all right, but then what's going to happen if the adults then come back and they try and negotiate the waterfall? Because the salmon from the blue population don't have the genetics that gives them for example, a big enough heart or big enough fins, they're much less likely to be able to negotiate the waterfall and therefore much less likely to contribute to the next generation above the falls. And the same is true for hybrid fish. So while your intention might be to increase population numbers above the falls, it's quite likely that the outcome of this stocking will be actually a same size or even smaller population of brown salmon above the falls. So considering the problems with mixing wild populations, you might consider an alternative approach would be to take a fish from the brown population above the waterfall, take some of the adults into a hatchery, spawn them in the hatchery, and rear the juveniles in nice conditions where they survive well in the hatchery, and then restock them into the wild. And you might even create a hatchery line in which you keep fish in the hatchery for multiple generations. what happens here is effectively that the hatchery is a new environment and it will impose selection. So for example, juveniles in a hatchery, they're reared at very high densities. There'll be selection for juveniles to be aggressive, because it's the juveniles that are aggressive and get more food that are most likely to survive in the hatchery. So over time, and research has shown that this can happen in as little as one generation, your fish in your hatchery will become a hatchery adapted stock. In effect, you've made a new domesticated population of Atlantic salmon. And then when you transplant these back into the wild population, of course you get the same effect as you do when you mix two different wild populations. The hatchery fish might survive great in the fresh water. Indeed, in some cases it might be that the juvenile hatchery fish survive better than the wild fish because they're more aggressive. But then when the fish, they smolt, they go to sea, and then they return and navigate the waterfall up to their breeding area, it's very likely that the fish with the hatchery genetics are going to be less successful than the fish with the wild genetics. And so in effect, by stocking hatchery fish in your population, there is a danger that you'll actually decrease the population rather than increase it, which was your aim. There are, of course, ways which you can manage your hatchery to minimise hatchery selection on your fish. And there's a lot of research being done at the moment as to how that can happen. But even if you're, as much as possible, have managed to avoid hatchery selection on your fish that you're going to use for repopulation, there are other dangers from hatchery stocking into wild populations. A hatchery, you have limited space and limited resources, so inevitably a hatchery population that you've developed for wild restocking is only ever going to be able to be based on a relatively small number of individual adult fish. But because hatchery survival of juveniles is very good, what your hatchery population is going to be is a very large number of juveniles, but each from a relatively few number of families, because you're restricted in the number of adult fish you can use. In contrast, in a wild scenario, you will expect to have more adults spawning, but the family size of each of these adults will be smaller, and there'll be great variation in family size in the wild due to natural mortality and predation. So if you take your hatchery fish, your hatchery juveniles, and stock them back in the wild, what you'll end up with is a very large number of hatchery juveniles which only have a few number of parents. So for example, here in this scenario, we have 12 parents, 10 wild parents and 2 hatchery parents. So the hatchery genetics, which are just from these 2 parents, make up 1/6 of the total genetic diversity that's in the river. And now I want you to imagine a scenario where a random 50% of these juveniles die. And this is just due to natural mortality, although it's quite likely that mortality will be increased because you've increased the density of juveniles in the river by introducing these hatchery fish. What's likely to happen is the adults, the small families from wild parents are going to be lost completely. So in this scenario, because you've lost these 2 small families, instead of hatchery fish being representing 1/6 of the genetic diversity in the population, now they represent 1/4. You've lost the genetic contributions from 4 of the wild parents, and you've only added 2 hatchery parents. So over time, this will gradually reduce the complete genetic diversity that is in the population. And as we've discussed before, genetic diversity is important for maintaining that possibility of fish to adapt to changing environmental conditions. So in summary, If you've decided that a transplantation or stocking intervention is necessary to rebuild a declining and threatened salmon population, an approach that takes into account the genetic differences and local adaptation of salmon populations in the different rivers, and also acts to maintain as much genetic diversity as possible in the stock, will both be the most successful in rebuilding the local populations, and also will maintain the genetic portfolio that salmon need to adapt to changes in their environmental conditions in the future.
Hello, I'm Melanie Smith, the Research Director at the Atlantic Salmon Trust. You've heard already from Edwin and others about the importance of the habitat restoration. I'm going to talk to you about the wild fishery population part of the programme. Wild fishery population is absolutely key to the programme, but one of the most important aspects that we need to remember is that restoring the habitats at scale is absolutely key. If we don't have habitats for the fish to live and thrive in, then the programme will not work and we won't have a thriving wild Atlantic salmon population. However, what we know from the IUCN classification of the endangered status of Atlantic salmon is that a critical low in the wild fish population has now been reached. And although we may be restoring the habitats, the fish may in fact not be able to respond quickly enough if we don't give them some help to ensure that that population is surviving. We also need to make sure that the unique genetics portfolio of the Dee fish is retained in any part of our fishery population programme. Maintaining that genetics diversity in the population is uppermost in the programme, and you'll see from what I explain how we're going to go about doing this. Key to this then is maximising the wild spawning adults in the river and wild hatched juveniles in the river. To do this, we're going to approach it in a couple of ways. The first of these is to recondition the kelts. The kelts are the adult females that have spawned in the river, are essentially out of condition because they've gone through that spawning process, and many of those die naturally in the wild as part of that natural process. However, with so few fish now, we need to look at ways in which those adult females that have spawned can be what is called reconditioned. So the kelts will be taken from the river after they have spawned, moved to the facilities at Stirling, and reconditioned using all of the expertise that Stirling have. Once they have reached that breeding condition again, they will be released back into the river to the locations where they came from in order to spawn as wild fish. So that's the first way. The other way is what's called smolt to adult supplementation. So the smolts are those juvenile fish that are going through and have reached that process where they're able to leave the river, moving from the freshwater environment into the marine environment. So these juvenile fish will be taken from the river at that point and moved into a captive rearing facility in order to bring them through to adults. Once they have reached adults, they will be put back into the river where they came from, and those adults will then spawn naturally, thus producing eggs that will then hatch naturally in the river in a wild situation. So those are the two ways in which we'll be addressing that critical low in the population. All the way through this, we will be putting in place monitoring. And there are various ways in which this will be done, but for the fish population, one of the key ways relating back to what Vicky has told you about will be using genetics. And by taking samples of the fish that are brought into that captive rearing facility and then released back, we will have genetic profiles of those fish. Going forward, as we capture wild fish in the river and we're monitoring those fish, we will be using the genetics in order to map what populations are returning and hopefully thriving in the river as the habitat is in place and improving. The reason why we're doing this in such a detailed way is because we're using the application of the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Conservation Translocation Protocol. Conservation translocation is essentially just moving a wild species from one place to another in order to maximise its conservation. So by doing this in the best way we can for Atlantic salmon, now an endangered species, we're ensuring that we're facilitating the hatching of fish in the wild as a priority. So is this happening elsewhere? Well, there are a number of places where rearing fish to repopulate rivers has occurred in a whole variety of different ways, and certainly we'll be learning from all of those methodologies. But there is one place which you probably have heard of in the Bay of Fundy area, where there is evidence of some success now of some of the approaches that have been taken. Particularly the smolt to adult supplementation that has been used. The main thing is that they have been able to demonstrate that fitness and fecundity of wild hatched fish is better and is improved through these processes of conservation translocation. So a couple of things that they have demonstrated already is that marine reared adults produce 4 times more fry than the freshwater reared adults. Wild hatched adults produce 1.5 times more fry than adults which had been stocked as hatchery fry. And early results also show that there's an upturn in wild juvenile densities. That is obviously a key part of the life stage, and we know that the juvenile densities on the Dee have been declining year on year, so we will actually be able to look to see if there's an uptake through, for example, electrofishing for the fish, there's an upturn in wild juvenile densities. And one of the key things about the Bay of Fundy programme is that it demonstrates the power of working collaboratively with all partners, stakeholders and communities across the whole of the catchment, and in every respect. If you work collaboratively, then everybody understands what the purpose of the programme is and everybody can play their part, and that is absolutely key, and the Bay of Fundy really demonstrates that. So in summary then, we know that fish repopulation has to be integrally linked to habitat restoration at scale, and that is embedded within this 20-year programme of work. And the focus for the fish repopulation is on maximising wild spawning adults and wild hatched juveniles. And most importantly, we're looking to make sure that this is demonstrating best practice of the way to go about doing this.
So I'd just like to thank our presenters, and now just to wrap up with some concluding remarks. So where are we now? Well, as Jonathon mentioned, we are currently recruiting for a programme lead. We're also currently fundraising to make all of this possible. And we are starting the urgent work of fish repopulations. We've been working with Scottish Government and its agencies for the last few months to get support and licences in place so we can collect the fish, and we'll be collecting the kelts over the coming weeks or month or so. We're also currently making plans with the University of Stirling to collect smolts this spring. In terms of where we're going next, well, we're continuing to work with government and its agencies to refine the methodologies for the fish repopulation work. So this includes the monitoring and the reporting of results so that we can all learn from this work as it develops. We will also be bringing on new skills this year to help assess the upper catchment and prioritise future restoration works. And there's new genetic research that will be starting this year. This is being led by Victoria, and it's to look at the genetics of the different run-timing stocks and build our understanding of the genetic diversity we have on the Dee and that which we need to protect. And that work is being funded by the University of Highlands and Islands and the National Environment Research Council. Also, we've been collecting thoughts and views from the 3 stakeholders events we've had over the last few weeks. Some of those views have highlighted the impact of in-river seal predation on the Dee's fragile salmon population, and we certainly recognise that it could harm and slow the recovery of our spring salmon stock. So now, Save the Spring is addressing the underlying causes of the Dee's salmon stock being weak and vulnerable, but it is also important that this predation pressure is removed to assist the recovery of our fish stock, because at the moment every single fish is crucial. So therefore the Dee Fishery Board will be building on the hard work of this partnership work and the recent IUCN reclassification of salmon to have new conversations with Scottish Government about removing this predation pressure. And then finally, what do we need for this programme? Well, we've got a short list for you. And firstly, it's a call for support. The climate and biodiversity threats affect us all and we cannot address them in isolation. So we really need to work in unity. And we need to spread the word because we won't achieve anything if people either don't know or they don't care. So please tell everybody about the threats and the challenges that our river and our fish populations are suffering and spread this urgent call for action. Secondly, we need practical help. So there is opportunity to get involved in our restoration work as volunteers. We will also be putting out a call for help with the fishery population work as this develops. But already we're really grateful to the gillies on the Dee for offering to help with the collection of kelts this coming month or two. Thirdly, we are seeking funding. So phase 1 of this programme, which is the first 5 years, has an estimated budget of £2 million, and that all needs to be raised by us. We've already had exceptionally generous support from corporate groups and private support as well, and that has totaled £500,000. And we've also had huge in-kind support from the University of Stirling. So it's all going very well, but we still have a lot more fundraising to do. Thank you very much for watching this video. We're really keen to communicate where this programme of work is and where it's heading in the future. So we look forward to updating you in the future as we develop more of the detail for this work.